Hi everybody, and welcome to this session where we're going to introduce you to some of the things that might be required of you if you're thinking about or if you're invited to be a reviewer for the Journal of Gender-Based Violence. My name's Nicole Westmarland. I'm a Professor of Criminology at Durham University, and I'm here in my position as Chair of the Editorial Board today. I'm joined by Emma, who will introduce herself just now.
Hi, so my name's Dr. Emma Williamson, and I'm a reader in gender-based violence in the Centre for Gender and Violence Research at the University of Bristol, and I'm one of the co-editors of the journal, which is based at Policy Press, University of Bristol Press, linked to the University of Bristol.
So, I mean, if we kind of go back a few steps, can you remember, Emma, when you first started to be asked to do reviews of articles yourself? How did that feel? How did that come about?
So I think it may have even been towards the end of my PhD, or when I just finished my PhD. And I think because I was in an area where there weren't that many academics doing research at that time on domestic violence and health, for example, if a journal got an article in about that topic, then they contacted me and asked me if I'd do it. So I learned on the job, I suppose. It wasn't that I sought it out. It's just, I think, depending on your area of interest, especially if it's a niche area, then I think people become aware of your work and then will contact you. And I think for PhD students and early career researchers now, if they have quite a high social media profile, for example, then more people will be aware of it. So they're maybe more likely to be asked to contribute and do reviews. And then I think as well, when I started then to submit journal articles, then obviously journals become aware of you, and then I think I started to get more requests in at that point. Yeah.
Yeah, because I suppose some postgraduate researchers can have a bit of a kind of a panic reaction, can't they, when they're asked to kind of judge something so important to somebody's career as whether they get published in a journal. But, you know, if they're the subject specialists, then they absolutely have a very important role to play, as other academics do, in judging as a peer whether this is suitable for the journal and whether the material is up to date, which of course often postgraduate researchers are more up to date with the literature than other academics are because they're really there with the topic every day.
Yeah, I think so. And I think it's good to have that mix of different perspectives. I mean, sometimes early career researchers can be even more brutal, if that's a word, as reviewers than kind of more experienced academics. And again, you kind of want a mix of reviewing styles. So it's useful to have that, I think. Yeah.
And that's important for a reviewer to remember, isn't it? That it's not just their review that is making the decision. It's an input into a decision that's being made by editors and by a group of reviewers.
Yeah, absolutely. And so the editorial team will always have read the article before it's sent out for review. Actually, two of us would normally read it. So when articles come in, somebody would read it first to check that it fulfills the criteria of the journal, you know, that it is generally the right journal for it to be at, and that it has, you know, it's not massively over length and things like that. And then it's allocated to one of the co-editors, who then take responsibility for reading it and then thinking about, first of all, whether it needs to be returned before it's sent out to review, or who the most appropriate reviewers will be. And we kind of have a process for doing that, in that we'll be thinking about who is an expert in that area. Sometimes we'll look at the reference list. So if an author has referenced a particular academic quite a lot in the article, then we might think, well, let's ask that academic to look at it because it is reviewing their work. And also that sometimes makes it more interesting for that academic because they can see how their work's being used by others. So it might mean that they're more likely to do it. And also we try and get a good split in terms of geographical location. So obviously, because we're based in the UK, we may have more networks and links with academics in a UK context, but we're very conscious of the fact that we don't just want that perspective. So we will very often look at other researchers across Europe and globally who may have a particular interest in that niche area. So for example, if somebody's written an article about bystander interventions, then we'd be looking at, well, who else has done work on bystander interventions in other countries, and then we would approach them to see if they might be interested in reviewing it. And again, I think, if you're reviewing an article, it also it gives you access to what is coming up. So it is a confidential process, which I think is really important to say, actually, because if you submit an article, somebody can't then take that work and run off with it. But as a colleague or a peer, if you're reading somebody's work and it's very up to date, you've got access to that ahead of time. So it's quite useful to see what's happening, what's going on. So as a co-editor, it's a really interesting role to have, but also I think as a reviewer, it's a really interesting role to have, to actually see what's happening, what's really new, what's sort of going on out there, really, and in different countries.
Yeah, I mean, I think rightly or wrongly, sometimes I decide on whether I'm going to accept an invitation to peer review based on whether I would be interested in reading this article anyway. And then in that sense, you think, well, it's only one extra step to provide the peer review.
Yeah, and I think that's what we try to do, because we know, as academics, reviewing is kind of seen, it's part of our job, but it's not something we get paid for. It's something we do on top of, we often don't get workload allocation, etc. So it is a big ask. We're conscious when we're asking people to review that, we are asking them to do something above and beyond what they're already doing, and that's quite tricky, which is why I think it is really important to say, well, actually, I think you'll be interested in this article. That's why I'm asking you. But obviously, if you're not able, either at the moment or it's just something you're not able to do because of other commitments, etc., then we absolutely understand that as well. Yeah.
What about if somebody's listening to this who has never been approached, and perhaps they wouldn't be on the list of references yet, but they are researching this area? How might somebody, for example, an early career researcher, come to your attention? How would they essentially offer themselves up to as somebody who's interested in doing reviews for the journal?
So part of the reason why we wanted to do some training for people who may be interested in and willing to take on this role, but who don't have that experience, part of the reason for doing that is so that they can contact us. We can do the training, we can add them to those lists so that they then are available, and then they become known that they're available to do it. They can email us. There's, the journal is online, so they can email the journal and say, oh, actually, I'd be interested in reviewing for this, I'm doing this. We can add them then, and share that information with the editorial team so that they can think, oh, actually, if we get an article in about this kind of topic, then we can send that out to them to review. And what we hope with the training is that actually it gives people a bit more confidence to do it, because sometimes when I've approached people who may have even been referenced in another article, to say, oh, actually, you've been referenced in this article, I think you might be interested, they'll suddenly kind of think, oh, well, I've never done that, I don't know what to do. And actually, hopefully, by us having this conversation and talking about it, it isn't it's not a complicated process. It is about reading it and putting your perspective, and that's taken on board with other things as well. So I think it is an engaging process, because you are in a conversation with your peers, your colleagues, which I think is a good thing. Like if you go to a conference and you hear a talk and you contribute and you have a discussion, it's kind of a slower, remote version of that when you're reviewing an article, and you actually get to see more of the detail than you get in a conference paper, for example. Yeah.
So how do you go about reviewing an article? If you think that you've been sent an invite, you've accepted it, and you're going to sit down and do your review, talk us through the steps that you would go through.
So the first thing I do, I would read it through for a first time, just to kind of get a sense of what it's about. And also partly because I think, a bit like if you're marking an essay, sometimes you'll have thoughts and comments, but actually it's something that's been addressed later on. So I try to make sure that I read it through first. And then we do have a set of questions. So I'm wondering if it's helpful for me to just share my screen and put them up, because when somebody registers and they go onto the journal site as a reviewer, there are a list of questions that come up, which I think are really good, helpful guide in a generic way to think about what's in the paper, and then sometimes I go in more detail. So let me just share my screen on that. Okay, so these are the reviewer questions that come up. And sometimes what I'll do is I'll kind of sometimes copy and paste these into the comment box for authors. What I would say is I very rarely write anything just to the editors unless it's a kind of procedural thing, because I think that although it's anonymous and you become reviewer 1 or reviewer 2, I think it's important to have that dialogue with the authors themselves. So I might copy and paste this in, and then I would talk about, answer these questions. So sometimes it'll be yes, partially. They can be quite brief answers. And then sometimes if there's, for example, whether the paper shows critical awareness of relevant literature, if I've actually done specific comments about on page 2, line whatever, you've missed some references, actually you might want to think about referencing X, Y, or Z, I might actually say on there, I've put a specific comment below. So I would do the more general things first, because I think that's helpful. And also I think sometimes that's a more positive, because often the articles, if they've got to this point, the co-editors are saying, yes, it should go out for a review. It's probably a reasonably good article anyway. And then at the bottom, I would have the more specific comments. So thinking about some of the papers I've recently reviewed, it might be that if they're using quantitative data, for example, they might not have been very clear about the sample. So it might be, oh, actually, you need to be really clear here that this is a self-selecting sample, because otherwise it might misrepresent what you're saying in terms of the figures. So, if they're saying 90% of people have experienced X, but it's a self-selecting sample, then you would expect it to be 100%. So sometimes it will be very specific comments like that. And again, I think that's why it's important that we get people who have experience in the field, but also they may have very niche experience, so on a specific topic, so they'll be aware of what the particular issues might be, and also whether or not an issue is contentious, if the language being used is contentious, and somebody who knows about that topic. So for example, as I used the example earlier about bystander interventions, there might be very particular terminology that's used when talking about those kind of interventions, which somebody who specifically does that work would be well aware of. So it's helpful to have that kind of thing, and they may put them in the specific comments at the bottom. But what I'm looking for more generally is and one of the criticisms I think that's quite common is we don't want things that are overly descriptive. So we do want papers, I mean, obviously they have to describe it if it's empirical research, what they've done, etc. But what we want is that there's some reflection on that, about, well, why does that matter? How does that impact on policy or practice, or and whether that's country or context specific, which I think is particularly relevant because we are an international journal, and what we want to be able to do is share that global knowledge and experience. So if somebody in a certain country has tried an intervention and it's worked or not, there may be culturally specific issues that have to then be taken on board if other colleagues in other countries want to try and replicate it. So people being reflective about that and trying to engage in the kind of broader theoretical perspectives about what that tells us about gender-based violence, how that contributes to our understanding of it, and what we might do to tackle it.
Absolutely. It's about making the reader do less work, isn't it? The reader shouldn't have to go and understand the topic themselves. We should be able to read that, and if there's parts which we as reviewers don't understand, yeah, the chances are other people won't understand it as well, which I suppose feeds into a little bit around the criteria around, is the paper accessible to readers who are not experts in the field, and it is about us reading to learn. So yeah, not using too much of that jargon or academic language, which can make academic literature quite dense, because I know you also have a practitioner and a policy maker audience as well, don't you, to the journal?
Yeah, and I think that's really important then, and I think it's good practice as well. I think we're perhaps in our area of gender-based violence, I think we're perhaps sometimes better at that than other academic areas, because we have many of the centres that do this kind of work do have those links with practitioners and are very keen to get the research out there, so it makes a difference. So I think we've always had that ethos, and so we're very much aware of that. I think the other thing as well, when we're looking at it, and something that we're very conscious of when we set the journal up, is that obviously we have people who write in articles in their second language. So English might not be their first language. And obviously that then is a disadvantage to them. So we're very conscious of that. So when we are reading a paper, if it's been written in English as a second language, sometimes the terminology or the language might not be quite right. But actually you can understand what they're trying to say and the points they're trying to make. So at that point, we wouldn't necessarily reject it on that basis. What we would say is actually the language needs a bit of work, but we can help you with that. And I think that's really important, because otherwise we exclude really important work on a practicality, really. And what we want is to be able to share that knowledge and assist people to do that. So obviously it needs to make sense in order for us to see that the points are relevant. But if there are some issues with language, then we would take that into account. And that can be, you know, one of the points. It might be, it needs to be rewritten thinking about the language, but actually the points that have been made are specific, you know, are fine and actually contribute to the field.
Yeah, and I think you know, it's not the role of the reviewer, is it, to point out every grammatical error or every typo in it. You know, it's about what has been done here and what is the contribution that this research makes, that the reviewer should mainly be commenting on, rather than kind of every single bit that may need a wording change. It's sufficient to say something like the paper has a number of typographical issues that need a thorough proofread or something, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think in terms of the process, just which I think is relevant to that. So when a reviewer submits their review, and we would get 2 external reviewers to look at every paper, we would then the co-editor would read them and check them through, and then that, depending on what the outcome is, that would be sent back to the author. If they've been asked to do major revisions, minor revisions, which is normally the 2 options that come back, then that goes back to the author, who can then come back. But the reviewer can choose whether they do or don't want to read that again. Now, from our point of view, it's better if they do, because they reviewed it the first time, so that, and they'll be able to see through track changes. So it's a less onerous ask, I think. But also after that process, when it goes back to the author, whether it's a conditional accept, there is another step that we go through as the editorial team. So that might be the point where we would assist the authors to say, okay, we've got this final version, but there's still some issues with the language. So we might, you know, annotate the PDF file and send it back and say, well, we've done some edits for you. Do you want to just have a look if you're happy with that? So we would have that process that happens after, so reviewers don't have to think about that necessarily. Yeah.
Sorry, we're nearly finished with our conversation, Emma. But could you outline, you know, we have this system of peer review, whether we like it or loathe it, but what might there be the benefit to the reviewer of agreeing or volunteering to be a reviewer for the Journal of Gender-Based Violence?
So I think if you're a researcher working in the area of gender-based violence, then it's a useful thing to do for other people, but then we know that anyway. But for the individual, I think it gives you access to new data, new research before it's out in the public domain. It gives you an opportunity to comment on that and to be a part of the conversation with other authors about where the field's going. It helps you can contribute to the standards of academic literature in our field by taking part in that process. I mean, obviously there's some advantages in terms of, you know, being able to say on your CV that you're a reviewer and you've done that, but also I think it helps you, certainly helps me actually, even now, it helps you as an author, because when you're reading things, sometimes you can think, oh, I do that. And you're kind of being critical of somebody else, but you're thinking, oh, actually, yeah, but I do that when I write an article, and I get why they've done it, but actually, no, that doesn't look right. So it gives you perhaps a different perspective and an insight into your own writing, which again, I think is a really positive thing. So I think for me, that would be the main thing, kind of being aware of new stuff and also learning, you know, the learning that we get from that for our own writing as well.
Sorry. Yeah, I guess it can also kind of demystify the process as well, that not everything comes out perfect and shiny in a glossy journal at the end, you know, that there is this process that goes on behind the scenes to get it to this stage.
Yeah, and I think there's that the kind of Twitter things about reviewer too, that kind of idea that there's a kind of good cop, bad cop type thing with reviewers. And I think, you know, sometimes you can get reviewers' comments and think, what? And be kind of quite taken aback by it. But actually, when you go through the process yourself of being the reviewer, you kind of get that a bit more, and you understand, well, they're just somebody, that's just their opinion, actually. You can disagree with the reviewer. And when you are reviewing, the author may well disagree with you. They may come back and go, actually, I don't agree with that. I've thought, but they've thought about it. And I think that's where that conversational element comes in. So actually being part of that process helps you to understand when you are responding to reviews that they're not like godlike creatures. They are your fellow colleagues. They are your peers. And it doesn't matter who you are. If you're a professor or you're a PhD student, your article is going to be peer reviewed. And yeah, and it may be, and that's partly why they're peer reviewed anonymously. Although sometimes you can tell, obviously, depending on the type of article, but yeah, it doesn't matter who you are, you still get that peer review. And I think I quite like that as a process. I kind of wish it was acknowledged more, but I think as a process, that's a really good thing to do. And I think it's good to be part of that, and be able to contribute in that way. And I've certainly learned a lot over the years by doing that. Yeah.
And I suppose being on both sides, you know, it reminds you to write in a way that you would want people to review your work as well.
Yeah.
So writing with that kind of kindness, even if you are pointing out problems with the paper, but writing a review in the way that you would want to receive a review of your own work.
Absolutely. And I think, you know, if everybody is going into that process with that mindset, that it is about us presenting, you know, work in the best way possible. I'm recognizing the limitations. You know, sometimes you get comments back saying, oh, you haven't addressed this, that, and the other. And you think, well, that's because I ran out of words, you know, that kind of thing. But it is actually part of that process about getting it to be the best that it can in the, you know, restrictions that we have. And I think most people enter into it in that way. Obviously, there's some rogue issues, but I think that is what it's about. It's about peer review. It is about engaging with your peers, showing them your work and getting feedback on that, which I think is a good process, really. Yeah.
Thanks, Emma. Well, we hope that we have encouraged more people to review for the Journal of Gender-Based Violence. We hope we've demystified the process somewhat in doing that, and we hope to see you on board soon. Thank you, everybody, for listening.